There comes a moment in every empath's life when the silence they enter is no longer a gesture of defeat, but a doorway into themselves. At first, this silence is misunderstood, even by the empath. It feels like isolation, like grief, like a final surrender. But underneath, it is not a collapse. It is a cocoon, a space untouched by chaos, a quiet unlike any they've known before. The kind of quiet where truth finally begins to speak, not with volume, but with clarity. We who are 6 years old, at first we were beyond the course of concussion. For so long, the empath has been the vessel for everyone else's storms. They have absorbed sorrow that was never theirs, taken responsibility for emotional fractures they didn't cause, apologized for their sensitivity as if it were a disease to be cured. And they did this not because they were weak, but because their love was so vast, so unfiltered, that it blurred the boundaries between self and other. They gave and gave, believing that love meant sacrifice, that devotion required self-abandonment, until something breaks, not loudly, but irrevocably. That break is sacred. It does not destroy the empath, it reveals them. The narcissist, always hungry for emotional attention, doesn't notice it at first. They mistake the silence for compliance. They believe the empath has gone numb, that they've grown too exhausted to resist, that they've folded into themselves like a discarded page. But what they don't see is that inside that silence, something ancient is stirring, something the narcissist cannot understand because it requires presence, introspection, and reverence for the inner world, things the narcissist has long abandoned. Within the silence, the empath begins to remember. They remember who they were before the gaslighting, before the manipulation, before they learned to doubt their own voice. They remember a time when their softness was not seen as weakness but as wisdom. They begin to see clearly the games they were pulled into, the subtle ways they were made to shrink, the moments they ignored their intuition just to preserve a connection that was built on illusion. The silence becomes their teacher. It brings discomfort, yes, but also discernment. The empath starts to trace every moment they gave too much, every time they betrayed themselves in the name of harmony, and with each realization, a fragment of their power returns. Not the kind of power that demands control, but the kind that simply knows its own worth. This awakening doesn't come with fire, it comes with stillness, with breath, with space. The narcissist, still clinging to their performance, doesn't sense the shift, because it isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it is total. The empath is no longer reacting, no longer feeding the cycle, no longer emotionally tethered to the narcissist's highs and lows. The absence of engagement terrifies the narcissist, though they may never admit it, because what feeds their illusion is not dominance, but the belief that they are still needed, and when the empath goes silent, they take back the need. In that sacred stillness, the empath begins to see their emotions not as burdens, but as sacred signals. They start listening to their own nervous system instead of dismissing it for someone else's comfort. They notice how their body tightened when truth was bent, how their spirit dimmed under the weight of false love, how their joy became contingent on someone else's approval. And in this deep inner witnessing, the empath makes the quietest yet most revolutionary decision. They choose themselves. There is no announcement, no confrontation, just a shift, a turning inward, a return. The empath may still appear gentle on the surface, but their center is no longer soft clay, it is forged iron. They no longer seek validation, they no longer explain their intuition, they no longer try to prove their worth to those committed to misunderstanding them. The narcissist will try to provoke a reaction, to pull the empath back into the dance, but there is nothing left to dance with. The performance has ended, and the empath has left the stage. What the narcissist never understood is that silence can be more powerful than screams, that when an empath stops trying to fix, to help, to heal what was never theirs to carry, they become something the narcissist cannot manipulate, a mirror. And that mirror reflects not the empath's wounds, but the narcissist's emptiness. It reveals everything that has been projected, distorted, hidden. And it is this unbearable clarity that the narcissist cannot face. But the empath no longer needs them to. The silence has taught them enough. It has shown them that true connection cannot exist without self-respect, that love is not meant to cost one's sanity, and that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction dressed as virtue. They rise not in vengeance, but in wholeness. And once they return to themselves, they never again abandon that home. Because the most dangerous moment in the narcissist's illusion is not when the empath cries, begs, or pleads. It's when the empath finally says nothing at all. The empath doesn't wake up one day with anger in their hands. That isn't how it begins. It begins slowly, quietly, with an ache in the heart that refuses to go away. It begins when the empath, after years of bending, softening, silencing their own needs, starts to feel the faintest tremble of resistance within. Not rage, not rebellion, just a small whisper that says, "This isn't love." For so long, the empath believed that love meant giving everything. They believed that if they just tried harder, loved deeper, forgave quicker, they could rescue what was broken. They confused tolerance for strength and compassion for a responsibility to carry another's pain. And the narcissist, drawn like a moth to this unguarded light, knew how to feed from it, how to use that deep empathy as both a mirror and a sponge, to be reflected, to be absorbed, to be central in someone else's emotional world. This is what the narcissist craved. And the empath, in their desire to heal, gave it all away without asking for anything in return. But over time, something shifts. The empath begins to feel the hollowness behind the praise, the apologies that lead back to the same behavior, the way their emotions are used as leverage, their boundaries ignored, their voice diluted. They start to notice that no matter how much they give, it's never enough to fill the emptiness they're trying to love. And worse, they begin to realize that in trying to protect someone else's brokenness, they have neglected their own. This realization doesn't arrive with fury. It arrives with grief, a grief that feels like betrayal, not by the narcissist, but by themselves. The empath starts to see how much of their life they've spent abandoning themselves. And this time, they don't want to be rescued. They want to reclaim. The word no begins to form differently in their mouth. It no longer trembles. It no longer apologizes. It no longer feels cruel. It feels clean. It feels necessary. And when the empath finally begins to speak it, not as a defense but as a declaration, everything starts to change. The narcissist, who has grown comfortable with the empath's yes, who has built their control on the foundation of emotional compliance, begins to panic, because the dynamic only works when the empath doubts themselves. When that doubt fades, the illusion crumbles. The empath for the first time is no longer afraid of being seen as cold, distant, or selfish. They are no longer willing to betray their inner truth just to maintain a connection that demands their silence. They learn that love without limits is not love, it is bondage. They begin to define love differently. Not as a duty, not as sacrifice, not as suffering, but as alignment, mutual respect, and freedom. This new awareness births boundaries, and these boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They are invitations to show up with authenticity. But for the narcissist, boundaries feel like rejection, like exposure, like an end to the game, and so they react, not with understanding, but with manipulation. They try to remind the empath of the old role. They twist the narrative, weaponize guilt, and use the empath's compassion against them. But the empath, now rooted in clarity, no longer flinches. This strength doesn't come from hate. It comes from love. Love for the self that was buried under years of emotional labor. The empath begins to understand that their sensitivity is a gift, but it is not a leash. That their love is powerful, but it is not endless. That they can care deeply and still walk away. That saying no to another is sometimes the only way to say yes to themselves. The narcissist may accuse them of changing, of becoming heartless, of being the problem. But the empath knows the truth. They haven't changed, they've returned. Returned to the self they were before they were conditioned to overgive, before they believed they had to earn love by enduring pain. They are no longer interested in relationships that demand their diminishment. They are no longer willing to perform for connection. This transformation is quiet, but it is seismic. It alters everything, because once an empath begins to enforce boundaries, they stop bleeding for those who cut them. They stop explaining the wounds to those who caused them. They stop tolerating the energy that drains them. And most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves to be accepted by someone else. The narcissist may try one last time to reel them back in. With charm, with promises, with fear. But the empath no longer lives in the same emotional world. They have stepped into something deeper, something steadier, a place where they don't need to be anything but themselves. And that self is no longer for sale. Because when an empath finally learns the language of boundaries, they are no longer available for the performance of pain. There is a quiet moment in the empath's journey when the anger they've buried for years no longer hides in the shadows. It rises not to destroy, but to be known. For too long, the empath has kept their anger locked away, afraid that expressing it would make them unkind, unloving, less spiritual, or less worthy of connection. They feared that rage would turn them into the very person who hurt them, and so they softened even when they were breaking. They forgave even when the wound was still bleeding. They smiled through violations, made peace where war had already been declared, and told themselves that love means keeping the peace, even if the price was their own emotional annihilation. But anger does not vanish just because it is silenced. It lives, it waits, and eventually it demands a voice. The empath, worn down by years of absorbing pain that wasn't theirs, begins to feel a pressure build deep in their core. It's not dramatic. It's not sudden. It's the slow erosion of a dam that was never meant to hold this much. At first, it shows up as fatigue, as resentment, as confusion. Why am I so tired? Why am I constantly giving, constantly being blamed, constantly walking on emotional shards just to avoid setting someone off? And slowly, the answers emerge. It's because the anger has nowhere to go. It's because every time they were disrespected and stayed silent, another stone was added to the weight they carry. It's because the story they were told, that good people don't get angry, was a lie crafted to keep them quiet. And then it happens. One day, in a moment that feels both terrifying and liberating, the empath no longer swallows it. The anger doesn't explode. It surfaces with precision, with clarity, with sacred force. It doesn't seek to harm. It seeks to reveal. This is the moment the empath's shadow rises, not as a monster, but as a protector. The part of them that has been suppressed, minimized, judged, finally steps forward. The part that says, I will not be used. I will not be silenced. I will not apologize for being whole. The narcissist never anticipates this. They have relied on the empath's kindness like a shield. They've mistaken gentleness for helplessness and compassion for compliance. They thought they had control over the empath because they understood the light, but they never learned the darkness. They never imagined the empath would stop trying to be understood. They never imagined that beneath that soft exterior was a will forged in fire, a fire that was never meant to destroy, but to illuminate truth. The empath doesn't become cruel, they become sovereign. And when the shadow integrates, when the repressed emotions are finally allowed to be seen and held without shame, the empath becomes whole, not fragmented, not fragile, not torn between pleasing others and betraying themselves. Whole. And in that wholeness, they no longer negotiate their worth. They no longer shrink to fit. They no longer tolerate being someone's emotional punching bag just to keep the illusion of peace. They don't scream to be heard. They speak to be free. They don't lash out. They draw lines. They don't fight to control. They let go of what never honored them in the first place. The narcissist, sensing the shift, tries to recalibrate. They may accuse the empath of being unstable, unkind, dangerous, but that is only a projection of their own unraveling. What they really fear is not the empath's anger, but the empath's awakening, because once the empath reclaims the parts of themselves they were taught to deny, the dynamic dissolves. There is no more supply, no more emotional fuel. The mirror the narcissist once used to admire their illusion now reflects a reality they can't manipulate. The empath is not interested in revenge. They are not interested in playing the same games. They have risen beyond the need to be chosen by someone who only ever saw them as a source of validation. They are no longer available to be consumed. They are available to be met. And if that cannot happen, they walk. Not with hate, but with sacred detachment. What once kept them tethered, the fear of conflict, the hope for change, the ache for validation, no longer holds them because they have seen the truth, and truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. There is no going back after this, no returning to the old dynamic. Because the empath has felt their own power, and not the kind that pleases everyone, not the kind that avoids discomfort, but the kind that speaks without shaking, the kind that claims space without apology, the kind that loves without losing itself. This is not the empath's breaking. It is their becoming. And once the shadow has been embraced, once the fire within has been acknowledged, the empath no longer fears their own voice. They become the one thing the narcissist cannot predict, cannot shape, and cannot survive without controlling, free. There is a moment in the journey of an empath when they finally recognize the emotional chessboard for what it is. They step back from the game, not out of weakness or confusion, but out of clarity. And in that clarity, they see the patterns. They begin to understand the manipulations that once felt like love, the twisted cycles of guilt, flattery, blame, and control that were dressed up as connection. They begin to notice that what they once called affection was often a performance meant to keep them compliant, that what they once accepted as love was actually dependency, wrapped in charm and hollow apologies. It is not easy for the empath to admit this, because to see the game is to grieve everything they invested in it. They grieve the time, the energy, the faith, and the endless forgiveness. They grieve the version of themselves that kept hoping, kept reaching, kept justifying the hurt. They grieve the love they gave so freely to someone who only took. And as painful as this recognition is, it's also liberating, because you can't free yourself from what you won't name. And now the empath begins to name it. They name the moments when their intuition screamed and they silenced it. They name the subtle ways they were trained to question their reality. They name the times they walked on emotional glass just to keep the other person comfortable. They see how their deep capacity for empathy was used not as a bridge, but as a leash. And as they name it, they rise above it. The narcissist never expected this shift. They believed they had secured emotional control, not through force, but through psychological confusion. They had convinced the empath that their love was conditional, that their perception couldn't be trusted, that their reactions were exaggerated, even unstable. And for a while, the empath believed it, because empaths are wired to take responsibility, to self-reflect, to ask, what did I do wrong? But now the question changes. It becomes, why have I allowed myself to be treated this way for so long? This is where the entire dynamic begins to crumble. The empath starts to observe, not absorb. They watch the cycles play out, the charm, the dismissal, the guilt-tripping, the strategic silence. But they don't engage the same way anymore. They no longer rush to fix, to please, to stabilize the situation. They stop explaining themselves to someone who never truly listened. They stop justifying boundaries that should never have been questioned in the first place. The narcissist tries the same tricks, but the keys no longer fit the lock. The empath has changed the code. What once provoked tears or self-doubt now evokes stillness. What once drew them into a spiral now meets a firm, steady center. The empath doesn't react. They respond. And sometimes they don't respond at all, because they've learned that not everything requires their emotional investment. Not every conflict deserves their energy. Not every attack warrants a defense. And this drives the narcissist to chaos. Because emotional control requires access. It requires the ability to provoke, to trigger, to destabilize. But the empath is no longer available for that role. They are no longer afraid of being misunderstood, no longer desperate to be seen through the narcissist's eyes. They've reclaimed their vision. They trust their own perception. They stand in the knowing of their truth. Not because someone else validates it, but because they have felt it, lived it, and finally honored it. They no longer play the game because they've seen it for what it is, a distraction from healing, a performance designed to keep them small, a dance that only ends when one person stops moving to the same rhythm. And the empath has stopped, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of peace, out of exhaustion, out of self-respect. They realize now that true love does not require this level of suffering, that emotional clarity cannot coexist with manipulation, that real connection cannot be built on a foundation of control. And so they detach, not with bitterness, but with grace. They let go of the illusion that they can change the other person. They stop trying to decode every word, every silence, every shift in tone. They no longer interpret mixed signals as signs to try harder. They take them as signs to step back, to protect their peace, to walk away. There is power in this kind of detachment, a power the narcissist can't access because it isn't performative. It's internal. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply removes the fuel from the fire. The empath stops feeding the drama, stops needing the apology that will never come, stops looking for closure from someone who thrives on leaving wounds open. They give themselves the closure. They become the ending. And in that ending, they find the beginning of a life no longer defined by someone else's emotional dysfunction, a life where their empathy is used for connection, not control, for creation, not survival. A life where they no longer live to be chosen, but live because they've finally chosen themselves. When the empath begins to reclaim their inner voice, it doesn't thunder into the room, it whispers first. It stirs beneath the silence they've long upheld, the silence they mistook for peace. For years that voice had been overruled, minimized, dismissed, not just by others but by the empath themselves. Every time they felt hurt and said nothing, every time they doubted their instincts to accommodate someone else's comfort, that voice faded a little more. But a voice that belongs to the soul never truly disappears. It waits, patiently, fiercely, for the moment it is finally welcomed home. And that moment arrives when the empath realizes that their silence is no longer a virtue, it is a cage. A cage where their needs have been exiled, where their truths have gone unheard, where their own essence has been diluted just to keep a fragile peace alive. They start to see that the person they became in order to survive the narcissist's world is not the person they were born to be. They begin to hear the soft but unrelenting call to return, to stop editing their emotions, to stop filtering their expression, to stop making themselves smaller so someone else can feel larger. This return begins quietly, but it is powerful. It begins in moments where the empath chooses not to smile when they are hurting, where they speak their truth without softening it for someone else's comfort, where they no longer rehearse the perfect sentence just to avoid conflict. They stop bending language like a shield and start using it as a sword of clarity, not to wound, but to protect. The words may come out shaky at first, they may feel unnatural, even harsh. But with every spoken truth, they feel more like themselves. And that feeling of being in full alignment is more satisfying than the approval they once sought. The narcissist does not know what to do with this. They were accustomed to the empath's silence. They counted on it. They built their emotional leverage around it. Because in silence they could project anything. In silence they could spin the narrative. But now the empath is speaking not to argue, but to stand. Not to provoke, but to express. They're no longer afraid of the reaction. They've already lived through worse. They've lived through the quiet death of their own truth. And now that they've touched that edge, they refuse to return to it. The voice of the empath, once buried, now becomes their compass. It guides them through decisions they would have once made out of guilt or obligation. It helps them say no without justifying, yes without permission. It becomes the sound of their self-trust echoing back through every choice. They don't speak to convince anymore. They speak to confirm who they are. There is no longer an emotional performance aimed at being believed or loved. There is simply expression, clean, honest, direct. And here lies the paradox. The more the empath finds their voice, the less they need to use it to defend. Because now their presence carries the boundary. Their energy speaks for them. The old dynamic cannot survive when the empath is no longer willing to contort themselves to keep it alive. The narcissist may attempt to interrupt, to derail, to gaslight with familiar phrases. You're overreacting, you're imagining things, you've changed. But this time, the empath doesn't spiral into self-doubt. They don't retreat into silence. They don't plead to be understood. They simply let the words hang in the air, untouched. Because they know now, being misunderstood by someone who benefits from your silence is not a loss, it is a liberation. The voice that once trembled now becomes steady. And it speaks not just for this moment, but for every moment it was silenced. It speaks for the child who was taught that emotions make you weak, for the teenager who was told they were too sensitive, for the adult who apologized for their intuition. The empath is no longer asking for room to exist, they're taking it, and that room becomes sacred space, where only truth can live, where manipulation cannot breathe, where the echo of their own soul becomes louder than the noise of someone else's projections. This change is irreversible. Once the empath has heard themselves, truly heard the sound of their own unmet needs, unexpressed pain, and unspoken truth, they cannot go back. They cannot unknow what they know. They cannot unfeel the relief of authenticity. The old version of themselves, the one who tolerated, who explained, who absorbed, no longer feels like home. It feels like exile, and they have no interest in returning there. But they feel like exile, and they have no interest in returning there. Speaking their truth does not mean they are free from pain, but it means they are free from pretending, and that is the deepest kind of peace. They stop trying to control the outcome of their truth. They no longer worry whether the narcissist will understand, accept, or love them for it. Because now they love themselves enough to let go of anyone who requires their silence to stay. Their voice, once buried in shame and self-denial, has become their shield and their sword. And with every word spoken from the center of their truth, the empath writes a new story. Not one where they are reduced, but one where they rise. The moment the empath decides to walk away is not loud or explosive, it is not fueled by bitterness, nor is it staged for dramatic effect. It is quiet, intentional, and deeply rooted in truth. For someone who has spent so long clinging to hope, rationalizing abuse, and carrying the emotional weight of a relationship that constantly drained them, walking away is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. It means they have stopped waiting for the other person to change. It means they have stopped bargaining their worth for crumbs of affection. It means they have finally chosen themselves. And this choice, this final decision, is what makes the empath more powerful than the narcissist ever imagined. The narcissist is not prepared for this kind of departure. They are accustomed to cycles, to conflict followed by guilt, to pain followed by reconciliation, to a dance that keeps the empath emotionally hooked, tangled in confusion and false hope. But now, the empath isn't looking for closure. They aren't seeking one last conversation, one final apology, or a moment of understanding that will never arrive. They've realized that clarity does not come from the person who caused the chaos, it comes from choosing peace over chaos itself. There is nothing more terrifying to the narcissist than the empath's indifference. Because when the empath stops reacting, stops explaining, stops engaging, the narcissist loses their grip. The hooks fall away. The strings dissolve. Control only works when there is an emotional reaction. But now, the empath has nothing left to prove. They are no longer afraid to be misunderstood, no longer hoping the narcissist will finally see their heart. They've seen their own heart, and that's enough. It wasn't a single event that made them leave. It was 1,000 little betrayals that slowly eroded the foundation of what once felt like love, the broken promises, the emotional manipulation, the way their boundaries were pushed, dismissed, or ridiculed, the moments they were gaslighted into believing they were too sensitive, too emotional, too much. It was the loneliness they felt while lying next to someone who claimed to love them. It was the hollow comfort of fake apologies, the emptiness behind the flattering words that were never backed by real change. And most of all, it was the realization that staying was costing them their sense of self. They didn't walk away to punish anyone, they walked away to save themselves. The narcissist might scramble, they might launch a final campaign of affection, suddenly attentive, suddenly reflective, suddenly desperate. They may promise everything the empath had begged for over the years, but the empath sees through it now. They've realized that love is not proven in moments of panic, but in patterns. And the pattern has spoken clearly. The empath is done trying to find love in a battlefield. They're done justifying abuse under the name of connection. What makes the empath truly dangerous in this moment is not their anger, but their clarity. Clarity cuts through illusion. It slices away every lie they once believed, that they had to earn love, that being good meant staying quiet, that forgiveness meant staying in harm's way. Clarity reveals that they were never too much. They were simply with someone who was not enough to meet them, to match them, to grow with them. And that realization becomes a sword that severs the final thread. The empath doesn't walk away because they've stopped caring. They walk away because they've learned that love without respect is not love at all. They've stopped measuring their value by how much pain they can endure. They've stopped confusing endurance with loyalty. They've stopped playing a role in a story that keeps them small, keeps them silenced, keeps them sick. Now, they choose space over closeness that depletes them. They choose solitude over connection that wounds. They choose truth over illusions, even when the truth is hard to bear, because there is power in starting over, power in saying, "I would rather walk alone in honesty than stay together in betrayal." The narcissist, who once felt so powerful, now finds themselves bewildered, because control does not work on someone who has nothing left to lose. Manipulation falls flat when it meets someone who finally knows their worth. The games end when the empath stops playing, and there is no act of revenge greater than healing in peace, living freely, and loving without fear. The empath does not need to make a statement when they leave. Their absence is the statement. Their silence is the declaration. Their peace is the revolution. They've reclaimed every part of themselves that was once scattered in the effort to be loved by someone incapable of loving without control. And now they offer that love to the one person who deserves it most, themselves. There is nothing more powerful than an empath who no longer fears being alone because they have come home to themselves. The most extraordinary transformation an empath undergoes comes not in the moment they leave, but in what follows, the rebirth. After years of internalizing blame, carrying wounds that were never theirs, and shrinking themselves to fit inside someone else's fractured version of love, the empath finally enters the quiet aftermath. At first, it is disorienting. The noise is gone. The constant drama, the highs and lows, the unpredictable shifts in mood and manipulation, and in its place, there is silence. But within that silence, something sacred begins to grow. A self that was always there, waiting. A soul that had been dimmed, but not destroyed. They begin to remember who they were before the confusion. They remember the softness that came naturally, unguarded. The way their love poured out without fear before it was weaponized against them. They remember how their laughter once filled a room, how they used to speak freely, cry openly, and trust without calculation. That memory hurts at first. It stings with the awareness of all that was lost, but over time, it becomes a beacon. It pulls them back to their truth. What makes this rebirth so powerful is that it is not a return to who they were. It is an emergence into who they've become, stronger, wiser, more discerning, not hardened but awakened. They are no longer available for the same cycles, no longer addicted to the emotional chaos that once defined their connection. They no longer mistake intensity for love. They see clearly now that peace isn't boring, it's safe. That gentleness isn't weakness, it's strength without performance. That love isn't supposed to hurt just to prove that it's real. They begin to build a new life, piece by piece, not from desperation, but from intention. They reconnect with their own needs, not the ones shaped by survival, but the ones rooted in joy, creativity, expression, and truth. They surround themselves with people who don't just take, but give, who don't demand emotional labor in exchange for crumbs of affection, but who meet them with reciprocity and care. The empath learns to let love in slowly this time, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They have learned that love must be earned, not pleaded for, that it is better to be alone than to be bound to someone who poisons their peace. In this rebirth, they begin to notice how deeply they have changed. They speak more slowly, with more thought. Their presence is quieter, but more grounded. They do not chase. They do not perform. They do not tolerate disrespect disguised as misunderstanding. They walk away from anything that requires them to abandon themselves. Their energy becomes a mirror, and only those who come with honesty and alignment can remain close to it. This newfound self-respect radiates from them, not as arrogance, but as quiet knowing. It's in the way they say no without guilt, the way they set boundaries without explanation, the way they prioritize their peace without apology. The people who once relied on their self-sacrifice will not understand it. Some will call it selfish, some will call it cold, But the empath knows it's sacred. It's the result of surviving what almost destroyed them. It's the gift of choosing themselves after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. This rebirth doesn't happen all at once. There are moments of doubt, moments of grief, moments when the old patterns try to pull them back. But the empath is no longer asleep. They recognize the pull for what it is, trauma's echo, not truth. And every time they choose differently, they break another link in the chain. They stop living from the wound and start living from the healing. And in that shift, they begin to taste freedom, not just the freedom from someone else's control, but freedom from their own need to be needed, to be chosen, to be everything for everyone but themselves. Now they are everything for themselves. And as they grow, something even more miraculous happens. They begin to inspire others. Their journey becomes a quiet revolution, not through preaching, but through presence. They show what it means to rise from the wreckage, to speak after years of silence, to love without losing yourself. Others feel it. They recognize the strength that comes from softness reclaimed. They see that surviving isn't the end, it's the beginning. The empath doesn't seek revenge. They seek rebirth, not to prove anything, but because their soul demands it. Because once you've seen yourself clearly, once you've looked into the eyes of your own suffering and stayed, you cannot pretend to be small anymore. You cannot keep living inside a story that asks you to forget your own worth. The past no longer owns them. The pain no longer defines them. And the person who once tried to break them is now just a chapter, not the conclusion. They've reclaimed the pen. They are writing new endings. And in those endings, they are no longer the wounded, they are the healed, the whole, and the rising.